Hi everybody, how's it going? Here we go. We are going to talk about nationalism and imperialism, the final phase. I know what you're thinking, like we're still on imperialism. Haven't we talked about this for a couple chapters? Are you sure, Miss Hall? We do have to talk about it a little bit more. Now, with that being said, before we get started, a couple of things. I would grab your chapter 28 questions, okay? Because I definitely will be talking about a couple of them. Now, forewarning, I will not be talking about the first couple questions, okay? This PowerPoint doesn't cover the first couple questions. So in order to help you on the first couple questions of your homework, okay, I have listed resources, the chapter 28 discussion and review. So when you're looking at the resources online for this chapter, there is a PowerPoint listed that has chapter 28 discussion and review. So the first couple questions that ask about like the new technology of this era, the population shift of this era, the labor movements, those first three questions, go look at that discussion and review PowerPoint that's more condensed, or the outline of the chapter, and you're going to get a lot more help in there answering those questions. This PowerPoint is going to focus on the second half of the questions, okay? The nationalism and independence movement of Germany. It's going to focus on a little bit about nationalism, how it helped Germany, how it hurt like Russia, Austria, kind of those circumstances. And then we're going to look at the different paths of, really quick, of China and Japan, okay, going into the 19th-20th century. So forewarning on that this will be more of a help in the second half. All right. Also, if there's an essay prompt for this chapter, I believe it's on Germany, I would grab that because I will be kind of touching on that as well. All right. So just forewarnings on that. So I'd go ahead and grab your questions if you have it. All right. Date range for the chapter, 1850 to 1914. All right. We are taking this right up to World War I. We are almost there. This is the final phase of imperialism. So this is the last major chapter that we will talk about imperialism. But nationalism is going to be kind of a newer, we've all used this term before. We probably identify more with nationalism than we do imperialism in our more common era, right? We don't really use the word imperialism anymore. That's more of a past tense term. Geographic locations for this chapter, we're going to be in Europe quite a bit. So we're going to be like in Germany, Russia, a little bit in the United States, Japan, China. So Germany is going to be the big one. We're going to talk about Germany a lot as our nationalism example. Russia a little bit, Austria a little bit, Japan and China a little bit. Key civilizations, they're going to be the same. We're getting to the point in history now where our geographic locations will also kind of be our key civilizations, where the nation state also represents the people. So it used to be in history that you would give a region, but then the people might be different. And now we're finally getting to the phase where the country also represents the people, which is really nice. So like I said, questions 1, 2, and 3, you'll probably want to look at that chapter 28 discussion review PowerPoint or the outline. And that will be really helpful in answering those first couple of questions. And I'm going to jump in to what nationalism means and the movement of Germany for the first part of our discussion, which will be really helpful on question number 3 and the PowerPoint. All right, so let's get started. So the part 1 of this is going to be all about nationalism. Now, nationalism can be really helpful toward a nation, but it can also really cripple a nation. So when you think about nationalism, I want you to see any movement can help or hurt you, okay? Any time that you're doing something like that, it can be helpful or it can hurt you. So the goal of this chapter is for you to not only understand what nationalism is, but to understand how it can help a nation, but it can also divide a nation. Okay, so we're going to look at 2 examples of that, but in particularly how it can unify, and then quickly how it can divide. All right, so Germany is going to be a great example of finally how it unifies. All right, so let's take a look. So what is nationalism? Nationalism is a strong feeling of pride and devotion in one's country. So this is probably a concept that you are familiar with, you know, an idea of you're proud to be a part of a nation. You're proud of maybe the flag that you know you stand behind. You're proud of what that country represents. Maybe you're not, you know, maybe you see a flag and you're not proud of what it stands for. You're not proud of what it represents. But nationalism in general is a feeling of pride and devotion to one's country. I've shared this before in class. I remember when I was a senior in high school, right after 9/11, and I'll never forget the overwhelming amount of sadness that there was, the overwhelming amount of just confusion and grief. But I remembered the feeling of pride we had in our country. And there was this particular moment of just unification that came together. And I have to say that in a very dark moment and sadness, there was a nationalism movement that I don't know if I'll ever experience again. And I know the times we're living in right now have been a little hard. There's been a lot of divisiveness, not a lot of unity, which is sad. But I have to say, when I think back to 9/11, there is a lot of sadness, but there is one of the, they say out of a hard time there can be good, and one of the good things I remember from it was just a time of unity and a time of nationalism, pride, and devotion that overwhelmingly people had in our country, where party almost didn't matter, and we were one unified people. And it was really neat to feel. And my whole senior year of high school, there was just this feeling of unification, of coming together to heal as a country, to try to figure out what happened, to want to protect our borders, to want to, to figure out what had happened, and to right that wrong, and to come together, and it was a unifying process. And not everything from that turns out perfect, and we learn a lot from it, but there was a sense of patriotism that I don't know that I'll ever experience again. And yeah, there was a sense of feeling of pride and devotion in one's country, that when I talk about how nationalism can have real two outcomes, we definitely, at that time, in my experience as a senior in high school after 9/11, there was a unifying factor that came out of it. Germany is going to go through a unifying process in their nation state building. Europe, for most of its history, up to this point, a lot of Europe at this point has created itself as we know it today: Italy, Russia, France, Spain. But one nation that hasn't really formed itself is Germany, believe it or not. Germany, up into the late 1800s, has not actually formed. Now, Germany as we know it today, the people were living there, but the boundaries as we know Germany today wasn't actually there. When we think about Germany, okay, sometimes we hear the word Reich. Reich means empire, all right? So there was the first Holy Roman Empire, and that goes back, to the Roman Empire, to the Holy Roman Empire, the Catholic Church. Later in history, when we get to World War II, there's going to be the Third Reich, okay? And this is going to be under Hitler, right? World War II, and we're going to talk about this coming up, all right? But the actual first unification of Germany as we know it today as a state, okay, is going to be the actual formation of Germany as a country. And that is going to be in the 1870s. So let's talk about the path of Germany as a state, okay? And this is where nationalism is going to be so important, and nationalism is going to help Germany unify them together. Now, what do you have to have in common to bring you together? We've talked about, groups of people that might not be unified under a political unification, but that have things in common. Think about the early Greeks. Think about the Mayans. What things did they have in common? Usually there's two things that tie you together: language and religion, right? The Germans had this. They had common roots of language and religion that tied them together. And so when we look at their roots, they had geography in common. So when you look at that map before, okay, you have France on one side, and then at the time, it doesn't exist anymore, you had Prussia and then Russia on their east. So you had France on their western border, and then you had Prussia and Russia and kind of these other smaller countries on their eastern border, and they were kind of sandwiched right in the middle. All right. And what they wanted was they wanted to be created as a state. Now, going all the way back to the Congress of Vienna in 1815, which was when Napoleon, right, the end of the French Revolution, Germany petitioned at the Congress of Vienna, which was the end of the French Revolution when Napoleon had created chaos, right, in Europe. The German princes had actually come to the Congress of Vienna and begged and said, okay, this is a great time, form us as a German state. Now, the Congress of Vienna was a gathering of European leaders to put Europe back together again, and Europe was an absolute mess. And they refused at that time to create a German state. Here's why. They were afraid that they would have another, so to speak, French Revolution, that they would have another young nation out to prove themselves, and that they could have another repeat, so to speak, of Napoleon, right? Another young nation out there invading. So what they decided to do was create a German confederation, okay? So take that large German territory, and it was dozens of little German states, kind of like what Russia was before it unified, before the Mongols took them over, okay? So it was a bunch of German princes. And what they did was they decided to have Austria, which was on one of their eastern borders, control them, aka kind of like a mentor or a guardian. So imagine if you were like a teenager and you needed a guardian, like maybe your parents couldn't oversee you, so you need like a guardian, someone to like legally look out for you. You know, you're not independent yet, you're not a full adult yet. This is kind of what Austria did. You know, they weren't technically, it's not that Germany was under them, but Germany couldn't go do whatever they wanted to do without the permission of Austria. And the Congress of Vienna decided, no, we're not going to let Germany become independent because, again, we don't want some new nation going out and kind of repeating what France has just done. We want everybody to kind of stay in their lane, so to speak. They were afraid of a repeat, if that makes sense. Well, of course, this made Germany really mad, right? They're like, oh, so everybody else can be an independent nation, but we can't. They were being denied what they felt was their rights because they had the German roots, they had the German language, they had religion in common. They wanted the unification and the nation state recognition, right, to be an actual power. When you're a bunch of little, you know, German states and not unified, let's be real, you have no real power, you have no real acknowledgement. And everybody else had their own independence. And so this was very, very frustrating to the German people. Along comes a man called Otto von Bismarck. Okay, this is a man that you want to get familiar with. In fact, if you're accessing this lecture through Canvas, you probably noticed his picture, but this is a man you're going to want to know. You're going to know him for your test. This is a man you want to know, okay? Because this is the man who leads them to their independence. Now, Otto von Bismarck was a high official in the Prussian Empire. So Prussia is going to be like just north of Austria. It doesn't exist anymore, but like in Eastern Europe, okay, so bordering on like Russia, just north of Austria, and the German border today. Doesn't exist anymore, but he was a very high official, and he was aligned with Austria. Now, he wanted Germany to become independent because he thought this would be a great extension of Prussia. This would be a great way for Prussia to build its empire. And you have to understand, we're in the Industrial Revolution, we're in imperialism. Nations are trying to build their power. So it's not that he cared about the German people, let's be clear, all right? Whenever somebody comes to you and says, but I care about you, and I want to help you, stop right there and be like, you care about me? You're trying to help me? No, what are you going to get out of it? You know what I mean? You might care about me, but what are you going to gain from this? So Otto von Bismarck was totally doing this, not because he cared about the German people. He cared about Prussia and his neighbors, Germany. So imagine it's like you're living on a piece of property and you have this big open field just sitting next to you and you're like, oh, it's just unused. And if I could just access that field, there's so much I could do with it. So the best way to imagine this is all these European countries are developed around a big open field. Vegas, we can imagine this, right? Like living in Vegas, we have open fields all over the place, right? And Otto von Bismarck is just sitting there in his developed country of Prussia, right? And he's sitting next to this border, you know, of this open field, which is these German states, and he's imagining what it could be if he could get his hands on this open field. But the problem is, if he tries to take that open field, everybody else is going to want it. The problem for Germany is their location. Number one rule in real estate is location, 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 right? And the problem of Germany has always been their location. They are sandwiched between a bunch of nations. France on one side, Italy to the south, Austria on one side, Prussia at this time on the other side. So if any one country tries to do anything with these German states, you're going to have a trifecta war because all these other nations want it. So it's kind of this attitude, if I can't have it, if nobody can have it, then we're good. So it's not that anybody really cared about Germany. It's just like, if we just keep them there undeveloped, then we won't have a problem. And the German people are like, but we want to be developed. And all these other countries are like, no, you're just a problem. So we're just going to leave Germany undeveloped, aka not a country. But Bismarck's just sitting there like, oh, but this is an untapped opportunity. This is such an opportunity, and I want to do something about it. Now, the King of Prussia is like, dude, we can't touch that. Because if we go and try to touch that open field that is Germany, or these German states, right, we could trigger a war with France. We could trigger a war with Prussia. We could trigger a war with Italy. We could trigger a war with fill in the blank, right? We don't want to do that. Otto von Bismarck is like, oh, but this could be so good. This could be so good. All right? So Otto von Bismarck is seriously probably one of the most brilliant generals in history, okay? He was a very smart man. So he decides, we're going to find a way to do this, all right? You have to eliminate the competition. So how do you do that? You align yourself. So first and foremost, they align themselves with Austria. So Prussia and Austria have an alliance. They're neighbors. This makes sense. They're on the eastern front of Germany. Everybody hated France. This was very simple. France had caused chaos in Europe. Nobody liked France. France had invaded everybody. They'd caused chaos, Congress of Vienna. This was an easy win, all right? But they can't take Germany because France, it'll cause war. Prussia doesn't want a war. So Otto von Bismarck has to find a way to start a war with France, but not make it look like it's his fault, because he's been instructed by his king, right, that he's not allowed to start a war. So, no joke, here's what Otto von Bismarck does. He sends a secret telegraph, a totally forged telegraph, from the King of Prussia to the leader of France, who is a descendant of Napoleon. Now, the whole French monarch is very sensitive about Napoleon, all right? Remember, I've told you, people in French history think Napoleon's a hero. People outside of France think, the man was crazy. They're like, the man caused chaos. Everyone within France was like, he was a hero. Look what he did for us. So it's very much his point of view. So the King of Prussia, this was supposed to be a negotiation about some political agreement, some, who knows, some same old, some negotiation. So Otto von Bismarck just changed some of the wording to basically say, your uncle was short, so are you. He's overrated, just like all of you. You all suck. You lose every war. Something to that extent, right? Insulting Napoleon, insulting the French, it's not hard to do, let's be honest. Up to this point, they were losing a lot of wars. No offense against the French, but it was true. Like, sorry, I know that the truth hurts, but it was true. The French were losing a lot of wars at this point. They lost the French and Indian War. They lost the French Revolution. Like, this was not a good point in history for the French. So it was not hard to be insulting to the French at this time. So Otto von Bismarck, changing a few things about the insults of the French, boom, he did it. So what the Prussian king thought was a very diplomatic letter to the French, Otto von Bismarck, just changing a few things around, turns into a very insulting letter to the French. The French are like, how dare you, you insult our lineage, da-da-da-da-da. We won't put up with this. Boom. They have war. The King of Prussia is like, what did I say? Oh my gosh, they're so oversensitive. The dang French, they're so oversensitive. Boom, they have war. And we have the Franco-Prussian War. Well, who do the Prussians have an alliance with? Austria. So the Eastern Front, okay, so you think about it, Germany is sandwiched right here in the middle. So Austria and Prussia, who are on the Eastern Front of Germany, have an alliance, okay, now are at war with France. So this is the Franco-Prussian War, okay, with France, who are on the Western Front of Germany. Now, who are the Germans going to side with? Well, like any good politician, okay, Otto von Bismarck, before he sent this very salacious letter, okay, to the French, starts spreading rumors to the Germans. Well, Prussia wants you to be independent. It's the French that won't let you. So this kind of propaganda, guess who the Germans are going to side with? Oh, it's the French the reason that we can't be a nation. It's the French. So guess who the Germans side with in the Franco-Prussian War? Of course, Prussia and Austria. So now you have the German states, Prussia and Austria, all against the French. So guess who loses the Franco-Prussian War? Duh, the French. Oh boy. So now, in less than a century, you have the French losing the French Indian War, the 7 Years' War, the French Revolution, and now the Franco-Prussian War. Okay? Yes. So this just builds the German nationalism. They're like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And guess who comes out looking like a hero? Who's a champion of the Germans? Who cares about the Germans? Otto von Bismarck, right? Otto von Bismarck. So this leads up to now you've gotten rid of the Western issue of Germany becoming an independent state. Now, the last obstacle of Prussia declaring Germany an independent state is the last obstacle of declaring Germany independent state is Austria. Well, Prussia and Austria have an alliance. So the French are defeated in 1870. Prussia then turns to Austria after the war and basically says, well, we're going to turn Germany into an independent state. Are you going to stand in our way? Austria's sitting there like, what? Totally backstabbed. Totally backstabbed, all right? Have you ever heard of the divide and conquer tactic? Yeah, Otto von Bismarck followed it to the letter. Prussia knew that you can't fight a war against Austria and France and Germany, right? You can't fight a war. So look at the manipulation. It's like, okay, how do I process eliminate? Well, I manipulate Austria into siding with us, right? Thinking that it's just the good old French always being the French with a hot temper. So we eliminate the French. The Germans think that we're a superhero that care about them. So now that the French are eliminated, the Germans think that Prussia cares about them. Now, who's the only obstacle to German independence? It's the Austrians. So now the Prussians stand back and go, oh, we want you to be independent, but now it's the Austrians. You know, they won't let go of their guardianship. And the Austrians are sitting there going like, what? What are you talking about? And the Prussians are like, Germany wants to be independent. Why don't you let them? Austria's like, wait a minute, that wasn't the agreement. Prussia's like, let them be independent. And if Austria refuses, now Germany and Prussia turns on them. You think Austria is ready for that? Nope. So Austria literally puts their hands up and says, fine, no warfare. Now Prussia gets what they want, aka Otto von Bismarck, because the King of Prussia never had this aligned, okay? And the King of Prussia basically steps back and goes, wow, Otto, you conniving man. Talk about a man who with a plan. Do you know what I'm saying? A man with a plan, all right? If you look at question number 3 off of your homework, all right, it says describe the role of nationalism in the creation of Germany before and after 1870. So before this part of the question, okay? Language unified them. Culture and heritage unified them because they didn't have government. So the common enemy of France and Austria, and then Otto von Bismarck. So before 1871, language, culture, religion unified them. The common enemy of France and Austria unified them. And then Otto von Bismarck used those things to his manipulation to gain what he wanted. Then after 1871. So 1871 is the independence date of Germany, where Germany is declared an independent state. So what does that look like going forward? King William I of Prussia takes the title of Kaiser, which means emperor, and becomes the leader of Germany. He later fires Bismarck. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why would you fire Bismarck? What do you think? This is the man who made it happen. Why would you get rid of the very man who made it happen? He's dangerous, you guys. Think about it. What were his specific instructions? Don't start any troubles. Now I know what you're thinking. Yeah, but he made it happen. Yeah, but it was dangerous. If this man can go behind your back and make this happen, now that he's got what he wants, what's he going to do with you? So Otto von Bismarck was a very smart man, but a cunning man. So William in some ways had to get rid of him. And this ushered in the Second Reich, or the Second Empire unification of Germany. So the first time Germany was unified was under the Holy Roman Empire, the Catholic Church. Okay, the second time that Germany is unified is the first time they're actually recognized as a state, Germany itself, and this is under William I. And then the third time, right, that they're going to build an empire is going to be World War II, right, when we see under Hitler, under World War II. They quickly join the Industrial Revolution. The very reason that they were denied you know, the unification in 1815, they jumped to it right away. William I didn't rule for very long. He died, and then his descendant inherited the throne, William II. They expanded social welfare, transportation, public education. They expanded their army, navy, and they quickly became an industrial giant. They joined imperialism, industrialization, manufacturing, building factories, getting raw goods, and they quickly became a competitor. So they quickly joined industrialization in a way that was super competitive, passed up Russia economically, and even passed up Prussia, and became just a super giant going into the 20th century. So this is an example of where nationalism can unify you and really drive you forward. You have that language, that common heritage, that drive to be recognized, and when channeled in the right direction with leadership can really be powerful. Okay, so the second part of the question, you unified through Otto and Bismarck, war, having their own boundaries, they wanted recognition, and industrialization can be really, really great. Okay. The difference between liberal and conservative nationalism, liberal nationalism is going to be more like democracy. So where you have a constitution and a representative government. So like Britain and France will be examples of that, where they had a constitutional monarchy. Conservative nationalism is going to be traditional, where you have an absolute monarch, okay? So like Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia will be examples of having an absolute monarch, where you have a single authoritarian dictatorship, okay? Where there is no constitution, there is no parliament, there is no representative body, all right? So in the last part of that question, you want to make sure that you give examples of that. Your essay prompt is just really a breakdown of that, okay? So when you're looking at your essay prompt for this chapter where it says describe the role of nationalism in the creation of Germany, so you're going to want to have one group that is Germany before 1871, so that would be your first group, okay? And talk about what unified them before. So common language, common religion, Otto von Bismarck, the same goal of unification, how that brought them together, okay? After 1871, so what did that unification look like? They came together through war, defeating the French, defeating Austria, Otto von Bismarck, and then William II, really driving them through industrialization, okay, using those things. And then what's the difference between liberal and conservative nationalism? So you'll need to subdivide that group, and it's a difference group, right? So tit for tat. So you have to have a liberal part, conservative, 2, tit for tat. So in this group, you'll need to have a part that shows, one has a constitution, one doesn't. One has representation, one doesn't. One has a monarch that shares power, one has a monarch that has absolute power, right? So that third group is a difference group, right? And then you have tit for tat. So one's liberal nationalism, or one's liberal nationalism, one's conservative nationalism, and then give examples of countries. So like France and Britain are examples of liberal nationalism, and then like Germany, Russia, Austria, Hungary are examples of conservative nationalism, traditional nationalism that we just talked about. So let's look at examples of where nationalism can tear you apart, okay? Where nationalism isn't great, where it can weaken you, okay? It can divide you. And so Austria is a great example of this. Russia is a great example of this. The Ottoman Empire is a great example of this. So those are 3 examples where it can weaken an empire, all right? And it's all for the same reasons. It's when you have multiple ethnic groups, okay, or religious groups. When nationalism can weaken an empire when you have many, many different groups. Let's use Austria as an example. Part of the reason that Austria backed down to Prussia, they decided not to challenge Prussia when it came to the unification of Germany, was because they were having their own problems. Austria at this time was also known kind of for part of this time as Austria-Hungary, and that was because they had their own internal problems. They were trying to hold together many different ethnic groups, the Poles, the Czechs, the Slavics, Ukrainians, Romanians, Serbs, Croats, Hungarians, German-speaking groups. And so when they were trying to, battle with the Prussians over, what would happen to Germany, at one point they were Austria-Hungary, and this split because they were so diverse. The more diverse an empire, this is when nationalism can tear you apart. When you have diverse people, that means you have many different languages, many different religions, many different ethnic groups, cultural groups that don't blend together. The very definition of nationalism is usually language and religion and ethnicity, common heritage that ties you together. Ethnicity doesn't always have to be part of it, but it often is a part of it. And so when you don't have those things in common, it often tears you apart. Language and religion often are the basis of that. If I can't even communicate with you, how am I supposed to connect with you? How am I supposed to feel any sort of loyalty to you if I can't even communicate with you? I mean, let's just be honest, I'm not. I mean, it's just a simple fact. Doesn't mean that I mean you harm, but I'm not going to feel any sort of tie to you. So nationalism can be a unifying factor. It can also be a dividing factor. So examples of where nationalism can tie, or can weaken. And so this is question number 5 off your homework. In Germany, Britain, France, it can strengthen. Why did nationalism weaken? Russia, Austria, Hungary. Multi-ethnic, multicultural diversity, where you have different languages, different geography, different religions. This diversity is going to be really, really different. The Ottoman Empire is another example of that. Remember, I showed you guys, we've talked about them many times, the sick old man. Just the sheer expansion of their empire is going to create diversity, and it's going to create challenges. And over time, you just can't sustain it. People want their own identity. They don't. If it's a Christian nation and you identify as Jewish or Muslim or fill in the blank, you don't want to be under a different identity. Or flip the script. If it's the Ottoman Empire was Muslim and you were, say, Roman Catholic or Christian or Jewish or whatever, fill in the blank, you don't want to be under a different identity. You don't want to be held to someone else's standards. It's just that simple. It's not that hard to imagine. Or language or customs or beliefs or practices. And with that often come laws, often come restrictions that people just don't want to be held to. And so these various groups start to revolt. The Serbs revolt, the Greeks revolt, and so slowly but surely it starts to break apart. Okay, so these diverse nations like Austria, like Ottomans, like Russia start to slowly break apart, and it really internally weakens them. So it makes them hard externally to grow as an empire when you internally are having such divides. So the thing to know about nationalism is that it can be very unifying, like the Germans, but it can also be very weak. It really depends on the diversity of your nation. And the more diverse, the harder it can be to unify. So some might argue, what is the United States going through right now? Is the diversity that we are experiencing, are we going through growing pains because we have diversity? And does that make it harder for us in the future to unify? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't know. But the reality is that the more diverse you become, it does become harder to unify because you have many different identities, you have many different religions, you have many different points of view, right? And so it becomes harder and harder to find commonality. It does. You're going to differ more and more on your view of the world, what's important to you, your religious perspective, which, let's be real, that religion does shape a great extent the way that we see the world, our perception of right and wrong. Language can be a part of that. Language can be less and less diversive because people can learn more and more languages, or we can change our languages. But the reality is that nationalism and having many different backgrounds can work toward nationalism, but can also weaken nationalism. And it definitely can help strengthen a nation, but it can also weaken a nation. And so we see so many examples of that. So again, in this chapter, we see Austria-Hungary, we see Russia, and we definitely see the Ottoman Empire. Okay, part 2, the final phase of imperialism, okay, which, remember, we define imperialism as one country's domination over another politically, economically, culturally. So I promise this portion we'll go through a little bit faster, okay, but it was really important we spend a little bit of time talking about the nation building of Germany. That was important, how nationalism can unify or divide, because that's going to definitely play into World War II. The United States was definitely joining into imperialism. when we get into the 1800s, we were definitely joining the imperialism phase, trying to gain colonies, industrialization, the need for raw goods, whether it be expanding all the way to the West Coast within our own country, whether it be conquering colonies, economic growth, immigration. So we were definitely kind of joining this. We call it manifest destiny, right? The idea that we were supposed to conquer from one coast to the other, that we were going to manifest our destiny, so to speak, right, of conquering from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and we were going to realize what that destiny looked like from one coast to the other. And in doing so, we took a lot of territory. We took a lot of territory from Mexico. Think about the area even we live, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of California, parts of Nevada, that were taken through war. Hawaii is a part of that. Florida, Louisiana was bought. Alaska eventually was bought. So there's a lot of growth in the United States, some through warfare, some through payment, some through just we're not giving it back. So there's a lot of controversy in that. Taken from Native Americans, there's a lot of controversy in that for sure, of manifesting what the United States looks like today. And we become an industrial giant, okay? We become an industrial giant of the Industrial Revolution. And I've said all along that the Industrial Revolution is an internal economic growth, and the imperialism movement is the outward expression of that, right? To feed the economic industrial revolution giant, you need colonies. So they go hand in hand, right? The internal movement is the Industrial Revolution, and the outward external expression of that is the imperialism movement, right? I need colonies, so you feed the movement. It's kind of like an addiction, sort of, And so what does the addict do? You go out and you find colonies to feed the addiction that is the Industrial Revolution. And again, Britain had always been the example of that, but the United States in the late 1800s kind of, catches up to Britain and in some ways surpasses Britain, for sure, when we look at these examples. So what were the motives? We've talked about this before. The need for raw goods, new markets, immigration, populations are expanding. We talked about this in a previous chapter with Australia and New Zealand, being relocation colonies. So there were two motives for imperialism. Some were for raw goods, right? Some were, so like India was an example of that. China was an example of that, where you take what you need, okay? But other examples were for immigration, exploding, populations, and there just wasn't enough space. So like Australia and New Zealand, where you literally wipe out the native populations and then you relocate people. Political, military motives. You need resupply bases. Japan was a great example of that. The Philippines was a great example of that. Like for the United States, the Philippines, the colonization of the Philippines, a great example of that. Wasn't necessarily for raw goods. It was a refueling station, a place to have a presence in another part of the world. Hawaii originally was an example of that, where we wanted to have a quick hop-off point to have a quick access to Asia. Humanitarian, we thought that it was our right, our duty, to help others. We've talked about this before, that I say this in quotes, that God has blessed us, and so we're supposed to help others. Okay. Social Darwinism, we've talked about this, that the European white race is superior, so it's natural selection, that it's our right, our given pecking order, our place in the development to dominate others. And so there truly was this belief that it was just what we were supposed to do, what we were designed to do. And that definitely ties into racism and prejudice, right? That builds racism and prejudice. When you believe you are superior to someone else, that does lead to racism and prejudice. That's exactly what it is, right? When I believe that I am better than somebody else, that is racism, that is prejudice, right? Especially when that is based on skin color, which is exactly what Europeans believed, and that extended through imperialism 100%. So European controlled most of the world. Why? Well, they had superior weapons, they had better technology. The slave trade had greatly weakened Africa. We had talked about the disproportional population, particularly of men. and stuff like that. They had the economic resources. They've been able to extract colonies. So economically, they had the industrialization where the colonies didn't. So they've been able to cripple the rich getting richer off the backs of the poor. So that classic bourgeoisie proletariat. So it wasn't just within the economies of Europe, right, that the poor were poor at the expense of the rich, but even the colonies, like I said, had played out, like Latin South America. Even once they had gained independence, they still were poor at the expense of the rich. So they still remained poor and weren't able to industrialize. They were still kept in that constant state. The superior technology and medicine of Europeans and United States then becomes a part of that westernization. The Maxim gun is an example of that. They had better weapons. So in any type of warfare, they were always able to win. So it doesn't matter if I have less people. If I have a Maxim gun, let's be real, I don't care if you outnumber me 2 to 1. I'm going to beat you because I have better weapons. It's just simple odds, and stronger centralized governments, better ships, better mobilization, and money to back it. So what are the problems with imperialism? Well, whenever there was resistance, which there was, or resistance to Western education, resistance to imperialism, then this would lead to the wiping out of native populations. So an example of that, like in Australia, we'll talk about this next chapter, they would just kill natives then. If you were in the way, we would just move you and get rid of you. When you get to U.S. history, you'll talk a lot about this with Native Americans, like Trails of Tears, what was done to Native Americans and stuff. So we definitely have a deep-rooted history of this in our own country toward Native Americans, and it's absolutely, it's genocide. It's sad. It's completely unacceptable, where you almost literally annihilate one population for the sake of another, right? You wipe them out, you dislocate them, you neglect them, you kill them, and the treatment of them for the sake of another. And this happened everywhere. This happened here in the United States. This happened in Africa. This happened in Asia. This happened all around the world. So imperialism at work, the final example. We've basically talked about imperialism everywhere except one country, or sorry, not one country, one continent. There's one final continent that hasn't been conquered, okay? We've talked about Asia, we've talked about Australia, we've talked about New Zealand, we've talked about the Americas, Latin South America. What's the one continent that hasn't physically been taken? Anybody guess? The one continent that hasn't physically been taken. We've traded with them, but we haven't physically taken them yet. That is Africa, all right? The scramble for Africa, all right? And that's what we call it, the final phase. So for a long time, Europeans had traded with Africa, but they never actually took Africa. So let's talk about why really quick. Why was Africa the last to be taken? Why were they the last to be imperialized, so to speak, to be conquered, okay? Trading with Africa is not the same as conquering Africa, okay? There is a difference. So why were they the last to be taken? Well, why did it take them so long? It's not that Africa didn't have resources. Believe me, Europeans were standing there on the outside going, I just want to take it. I just want to take it. They couldn't. One, Africa was very wild, and what I mean by that was they didn't have what they needed to take it, to go into the depths of Africa. Every couple hundred miles, you would come across a new tribe. The jungle, the disease, the weapons, the resources to literally get through the jungle, to get through the malaria was a real killer at the time. They didn't have the ships, they didn't have the boats, they didn't have the machinery they needed to get into the depths of these areas. They just couldn't. They literally would kill them. And so finally in the late 1800s, Europeans had what they needed to do this. And so in the 1890s, we have what will be called the Scramble for Africa, all right? And this is literally where they call it a scramble because in literally a decade, and I'm going to have you watch a part of the crash course again because he does a great job of talking about the Scramble for Africa, but literally in a decade, okay, in 10 years, it's literally what you would call like a scramble. Like Europeans literally rush in and within 10 years, gobble up what you see in this map, Africa. And that's why we call it the final phase or the final movement of imperialism, okay? There's really two exceptions to this. And that's what's really, really sad about this. There's really only a couple of exceptions. Ethiopia is able to resist because they bought weapons, and Algeria. There's just very, very few exceptions that were able to resist the scramble for Africa. And it's like, how is this able to even happen? So Ethiopia is able to resist because they bought European weapons. They kind of saw the writing on the wall, so to speak. But everybody else is going to be gobbled up in this scramble for Africa. So what happens is Europeans get together, okay, in the Berlin Conference. They get together and they basically decide, okay, we're going to go for this. So how are they able to do this? Well, they modernize. They have better ships, finally. They have medicine that can counteract malaria, which is a big deal. They have gunboats, and they have now weapons that they can take into the interior. And they meet in the Berlin Conference in the late 1800s, okay? And basically between 1890 and 1900, they go for it. And by the 1890s, Africa is colonized, is conquered, so to speak, as you can see in this map, by Europeans, gobbled up in the course of a decade, and it is so sad. So the Berlin Conference was a meeting of Europeans. Guess who wasn't invited? Anybody from Africa, okay? Any of the African leaders. And this meeting was basically to get together and say, all right, let's divide up Africa. Let's not get in each other's way, because it's going to be hard enough to take Africa. So let's not get in each other's way. So the Berlin Conference was a meeting of European leaders to decide who was going to take what, who was going to go for what. Oh crap, I just started recording. Okay, so the Berlin Conference was from 1884 to 1885, and then after that, in the late 1880s, really by the 1890s, Africa was completely consumed by Europeans and colonized. And like I said, very few exceptions. Ethiopia was one example of that was able to resist this colonization by Europeans. And the only two exceptions were Ethiopians and Algerians, which is really, really sad. So the final phase of imperialism is the scramble for Africa, is the nickname that it gets. Nationalism is tearing the Ottomans apart through all of this, again, because of internal revolts, and World War I is going to tear them apart. Another example of imperialism is going to be the Suez Canal. So here's a really crafty moment. The British decided not to invade Egypt, okay? Egypt thought that they were going to avoid imperialism, but they decided instead to give Egypt an outrageous loan. Now, if you've ever thought about it, it would make sense that one of the fastest ways to get to Asia would be if you could just cut a big right hole between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, but it had never been done. Well, Egypt is the key to this, right? And Egypt saw an opportunity but didn't have the industrialization. So Britain gives them a loan and says, if you can build a canal, we'll finance it, go for it. So the Egyptians start to build this canal, but they're in way over their heads, okay? They don't have the infrastructure. They don't have the engineers. They don't have the ability to do it. And before they even really get started, they're behind schedule. They're over budget. It's not working out. And here's the problem with it. The British know that the Egyptians are going to fail, and they give the loan knowing, really, that the Egyptians are going to fail and, in fact, wanting them to fail. So why would you think that they would do it knowing and wanting the Egyptians to fail? Well, think about it. When you give a loan and someone defaults, what do you get to do? Like on a car, what do you get to do? Or on a house, what do you get to do when someone defaults on that loan? What do you get to do? You get to take possession of it. So the British, instead of physically invading Egypt, gave this loan for the Suez Canal, let the Egyptians dig themselves into this horrible hole of building this canal, getting themselves super in debt, build this canal, get so in debt that they can never finish it. They can never, get themselves out of debt. The British then, when it comes time to pay the loan, the British are like, pay your loan. And the Egyptians are like, well, we're not quite done. We can't pay the loan. And the British are like, oh, darn, we get to foreclose. The British get to foreclose on the debt. How crafty is this? Okay, and take possession of the Suez Canal. I mean, it's kind of brilliant on the British part. It sucks for the Egyptians. So this is another example of imperialism. So now the British then get to control the Suez Canal, which, think economically, I mean, what a huge advantage this is. You now control the fastest connection to Asia between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. How much time that saves. And now everybody else has to kiss up to you, right? Has to be nice to you to get that connection to the Red Sea, therefore to get to the Indian Ocean. I mean, it's huge. It's huge. Giving a loan, knowing that the Egyptians don't have the infrastructure, don't have the engineers, don't have the ability to take on a project of this magnitude. Defaults. And the British were like, oh darn, we have to come in and we have to take possession. And they take possession of this canal going forward well into the 20th century and is a huge economic advantage for them. So another example of imperialism. India, again, was another example that we talked about, the BEIC, and how they, took advantage of, in India, imperialism, exploited the Indian people, their raw goods. None of this imperialistic movement helped the people of India. All it did was benefit the people back in Britain. It exploited raw goods. It created famine. It created poverty within India. When the put-out system, right, was ended in India with cotton, and all that development of cotton and textiles was done back in England, so many women and children out of work. It really, really hurt them. There were some positive effects of having, Britain within India. It did bring peace and order because you did have the soldiers and you did have the presence of European government. They revised the legal systems, communication, transportation. There was some modernization brought. There was some public education that was brought. But overall, it crippled them as an economy at the expense of, of British imperialism. And India is not going to become an independent nation until 1947, after World War II, and we'll talk about that as we get into, the 20th century. White man's burden. This really sums up what this is kind of about. This really does kind of sum it up, what they believed it was about. This is an actual ad from a magazine or a newspaper of the time. Okay, so here's what it says. The first step toward lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Pear's soap. So this is an actual ad, and Pear's soap existed. It was an actual brand, and it would go to the colonies. And so this is both literal and figurative. So look at how cunning this marketing is. Okay, so this picture is probably on a ship, an admiral or something like that on a ship, and he's washing his hands. So it's literally talking about the soap. But then look at the figurative message of lightening the white man's burden. The white man's burden, right? He has to go out and help all these natives, and it's just so hard, And if we could just teach these natives about cleanliness, how it would help them, and Pear's soap is a way to help them, And there's a couple references here. There's a reference of teaching them about, through ministry, about, European religion. There's the reference of teaching them about hygiene, obviously soap. And then there's the reference of the superiority of skin color, right? Of lightening, right? Lighter skin, all right? And the darkness, that the burden of the darker skin, that they're not as developed, right? There's definitely a racism prejudice reference here. Look here in the right-hand corner. So this is where the figurative reference comes in of racism. You see the man kind of standing. This would be a common attire for like a missionary, okay? And then see the man kind of like squatting down. This would be like a native. Tell me any time in history where you have ever encountered somebody when you've greeted them that they've squatted down. When I think of something squatting down, what kind of animal do you think of? Maybe like an ape or a monkey, like when you've been to the zoo. Okay, so all these boxes on the shore, what are those? Those are Pear's soap, right? So what is the missionary handing to this man that's squatting down? Soap, right? They're portraying a native as what? No more developed. So he might look like a man, but how does he act? What's his mental development? Yeah, like an ape, right? So they're portraying it like, see what we're dealing with? We're dealing with nothing better than an ape, than a monkey. Like that's how racist, that's how prejudiced, this is portrayed, and this was common. This is truly what they believed. It was white man's burden. Okay, it's just see what we have to go out and do, but don't worry, we're here to help you, we're here to support you, and we'll get through this together one way or another. We'll get through this. The potent factor of brightening the dark corners of the earth of civilization demands as well among the cultures of our nation to hold the highest place. It is an ideal toilet soap. So many hidden messages there, literal and figurative. Okay, but this is what they believed. Truly, this is what they believed, that these natives in all parts of the world were no better than an ape or a monkey. When we look at, this is the final point that I'm going to make. When we look at, and this is in your questions, you'll want to have this final question up, okay? It says, compare and contrast the influence of Europe and the United States in China and Japan between 1850 and 1914, okay? When we look at the impacts of imperialism, China really got the bad end of the stick, right? China, two things. China reacted to imperialism with rejection, right? And so as a result of that, we talked about the Opium Wars, right? When they rejected imperialism, Britain wasn't going to take it. They started smuggling in opium. It got their population addicted, right? So we reviewed this. The Opium Wars, they lost. They had the Treaty of Nanking, which was a totally unfair war. Britain received huge indemnities, right? Debts. They got the territory of Hong Kong. They had to open up 5 different ports. British citizens received, extraterritoriality, which meant that they didn't have to follow any of the Chinese laws. And China just really spiraled out of control, right? They had, internal rebellions, the Boxer rebellions, internal civil wars, and just through the rejection of imperialism, self-imploded, right? Going into the 20th century is going to struggle and will become victims of imperialism because they were so used to their domination, they couldn't imagine a time that they wouldn't be dominant, and it was just unfathomable to them. Okay, so China kind of has 2 things going against them. One, they have so much interest in them. So one, they have so much resources that they have extra interest in their resources, right? So European interest in them is just over the top. So they're not going to get away from imperialism. So that's part of it. But also their reaction to imperialism, of rejecting imperialism, rejecting that the tides have turned in modernization, they're going to fall victim to it. So they kind of 2 things. There's so much interest in them, and 2, their rejection of modernization, imperialism. They are going to experience the worst version of imperialism, right? Okay. So when you have to compare and contrast European and United States in China and Japan, what's similar about China and Japan? Well, both were dominated by westernization. Both were forced to open their borders, right? Both had interest and are going to fall victim to westernization and imperialism. Both will. Japan, though, is going to have a different experience, okay? Both were forced to open their borders. China was forced to open their borders with the Treaty of Nanking. Japan is going to be forced to open their borders, with Admiral Perry. The United States wanted a refueling station. So both are forced to open their borders. Both are forced to come out of isolation. But Japan is going to have a different reaction. China rejected westernization, so therefore falls victim to it, right? They fall victim to it and therefore struggle into the 20th century. World War I, World War II, they really struggle. Japan is sitting back and they're watching the Opium Wars. They're watching 2 internal revolutions that over 20 million people die. They watch the British take advantage of the Chinese. They watch China fall further in debt. They watch all this. Japan got lucky, first and foremost. Japan got lucky because when the U.S. Navy ships showed up, okay, and they were forced to open up their borders, the only interest in Japan was not internal but external. They just wanted a refueling station. There was no internal interest. So that's where Japan got lucky. The interest in China was internal. It wasn't just in refueling stations. So Japan got lucky. That's a contrast, okay? So a similarity was both were dominated by westernization. Both were forced to come out of isolation, right, and open their borders. But the difference was China resisted Westernization. They resisted technology and therefore were forced to become conquered by that, right? The Opium Wars, the Treaty of Nanking, the rebellions, 20 million people died. They had to play by the rules of the British. Japan decided to, if you can't beat it, then join it. You know, it's like if you can't beat it, then join it. And so they did. They ended their isolation. Now, they got lucky in that there was only external interest in them. So they did get lucky. But they decided, I don't want to turn out like China. I don't want that same fate. And so they decided to modernize. And they decided to turn this around. So they modernized their military. They hired Westerners to come and train. They replaced their samurai class with modern weapons. They bought modern guns. They bought modern cannons. They got rid of their dynamos, and they went through the Meiji Restoration. I talked a little bit about this in another chapter. The Meiji Restoration, the dynamos and samurais revolted. They didn't like this. They didn't like the traditional ways going. But their leadership, they gave power back to their emperors and said, no, we are going to modernize because we can't defeat what is going to happen. If we don't join Westernization, we will fall victim to Westernization because look at what's happening in China. And by doing this, by the time we get to World War I, they will be a powerhouse. The result is 20th century. When you look at 20th century, when you look at World War I, World War II, China is a victim of Westernization. World War I, World War II, China really struggles. World War I, World War II, Japan is a powerhouse. Japan is the most powerful country in Asia in World War I and World War II, hands down. They are the most powerful nation in Asia in both world wars because they modernize in the late 1800s. They take Westernization and they adopt it. They modernize how they do things. The Russo-Japanese War in the early 1900s, they beat Russia. This was so embarrassing to Russia. Can you imagine Russia, a massive country, covers Eurasia, is defeated by a small island nation that is Japan? Literally, Europe is laughing at them. Like, you were defeated by an Asian country that's an island nation. What is wrong with you? We don't respect you. Yet another reason that Russia was continued to be rejected by the rest of Europe. They modernize and they continue to have success very quickly. Sino-Japanese War in 1894, this was kind of their first time testing it out, testing out their modernization. You can see how they're dressing more like Westerners and stuff. They got Western ships, again, guns, the way they did things. And this was actually one of their first defeats toward the Chinese. This was a big deal. They had always been a tributary of the Chinese. They pushed away against the Koreans. They had always been victim of Korea and China, and now they are putting Korea and China in their place. This is a huge shift. This is a huge shift. They had never been the powerhouse in Asia, and yet here they are flexing and showing power. And again, going into the 20th century, they are the powerhouse of Asia. They're the powerhouse of Asia. No one else has that. And it's because of their reaction. So the compare-contrast, the similarity is that both are forced to open their borders. Both are forced to come out of isolation. The difference is their reaction to Westernization. China resists, China falls victim, right? The Opium Wars, the Treaty of Nanking, and they struggle. And in that resistance, they have, civil wars, they have rebellions, and they struggle into the 20th century. Japan got lucky that there was no internal interest. If there was internal interest, they would have had the opportunity, right? They wouldn't have had the opportunity. But because there was an interest, they decided to capitalize, learn from the Chinese mistakes, their experience, and look at what they did with it. So impact. Well, definitely the U.S. comes out of imperialism, probably one of the most powerful countries. Going into the 20th century, there's definitely no doubt that the U.S. comes out a powerhouse and surpasses Britain. Britain in the 1800s was probably one of the most powerful nations in the world, and the U.S. comes into the 20th century one of the most powerful nations in the world. We see the Panama Canal. We will get involved in local conflicts. We will find ways to insert ourselves and where the British got the Suez Canal, we are going to get involved in local conflicts in Latin America. We'll build the Panama Canal. All right, so we will find ways to build up ourselves. Impact of imperialism. Even if it's not really through actually politically controlling colonies anymore, it's economically controlling. Money economies will replace barter economies, okay? Modernization, banking systems, new technologies, capitalism is really going to rise. Cultural impact. Western culture becomes the dominant culture. Christianity becomes really kind of a worldwide precedence, more so than Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Confucianism. Urbanization really becomes the new standard of living. We see that. And all this tension is going to set the stage. All this tension is going to set the stage and tip over for the world to go to war. Imperialism is the cause of World War I. So what is all this imperialism? What does all this conquering lead to? All this flexing leads to Europeans and United States going to World War I, when all these colonies are then dragged into wars. Because what happens is that these colonies are aligned with European countries or the United States. And it's a domino effect then. When Europe goes to war, then colonies go to war. And that is how the world goes to war. And that is where we're headed. Hope you guys have a great day, and we'll talk soon.